we don't just want to be great brands, we want to be great businesses. So if you want to be great at business and build this empire, you have to be great at business, not just great at design or great at fashion or great at beauty. You need to build up your business acumen. It is simply impossible for me to believe that you will go on to build this empire if you don't know your gross profit margin, you don't know your operating expenses, you don't know your cost of goods sold. You need to know those numbers. All right, today I'm going to talk about my 50-30-20 rule. Now, this is a rule that I created to be a framework for brands that they can follow that will get them to about 20% net profit. And the reason that I created this framework is because a lot of businesses, including me initially, were running with no real guide on how much to spend on running their business, what sort of net profit is achievable in e-commerce, and what sort of gross profit you need to achieve success. So 50-30-20. The 50 is your gross profit margin, the 30 refers to your operating expense ratio, and the 20 is your 20% net profit. So before I explain each of those ratios, it's important to know what each of them are. So your gross profit of 50 is not your intake margin, and let me explain that. Your intake margin is the margin on your product, so what you buy it for versus what you sell it for. So you know that I always talk about having a 70% intake margin, a 70% margin on your products. How does that come down to 50? Well, you take your intake margin and then you typically have 15 to 20% other cost of sales, including delivery to your customers, merchant fees, packaging, and so on. So you're coming from 70, ideally down to 55%, but I say 50 is the lowest you should be at for your own label. So starting with a 70% intake margin on your products, other cost of sales applied, freight, etc., should get you down to 55, but I say 50. So we want to be at least 50% on your gross profit margin. Then we go down to the 30. The 30 stands for your operating expense ratio of 30%. In other words, every month you should be spending 30% of your monthly sales ex-tax on running your business. Running your business means advertising, wages, rent, all those sorts of overheads. 30% of your monthly revenue is what you should be spending on your OPEX, your operating expenditure. And your aim is to get as close to that 30 as possible. The 20 is the net profit left over because your net profit is simply your gross profit less your operating expenses. So your 50 gross profit minus your 30 operating expenses, 50 minus 30 equals 20. So those ratios are created by me, 50-30-20, to help you maintain profitability. So these are the rules that I created that I've seen time and time again work in e-commerce. And what we find is there's a lot of great ideas out there, a lot of good creative people, and they don't really have any framework around their business. Applying frameworks to your business is one of the best ways to grow. And that's often what I teach my clients to do, is to operate within a set of guidelines. In other words, you know what? Here's my 50-30-20 rule. Your job is to stay within it. And it's remarkable how often businesses who aren't profitable turn profitable following this rule. So 50-30-20, go and apply it to your own business. Of course, there are a few rules and a few tweaks. And that's the beauty of ratios. They move up and down. So can they be changeable? Absolutely. So anytime I talk about my 50-30-20 rule, I get a lot of comments. I get a lot of those aha moments. Thank you. That's what I've been missing. I also get a lot of people saying, no, that can't be right. It's not possible to get a 50% margin, or it's not possible to run your business on 30% operating expenses. Okay, so I want to break down a few of those questions that I get and anticipate a few of those questions that you have, and I'm going to answer them. Firstly, is it possible for all e-commerce businesses to get a 50% gross profit margin? No. Straight off the bat, if you're a multi-brand seller, multi-brand retailer, in other words, you're a sports store buying from Nike, buying from Reebok, there's no chance that those brands are going to give you that 70% intake margin that you need to translate into a 50 to 55% gross profit margin. So when I talk about the 70% intake margin, I'm really talking about people creating their own product, either designing and building a product or white labeling a product, importing a product, their own brand essentially. Does that mean that this 50-30-20 rule doesn't work for multi-brand retailers? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And I'm going to explain the beauty of ratios is that they can be moved. So what's important here is not necessarily the 50, the 30, and the 20, but the concept of the framework. So let's say, for instance, that you're buying off Nike and Reebok, or you're a online homewares retailer, and you're buying from a middleman. You're buying from wholesalers. You're not creating your brands. You're stocking brands. You're likely to get closer to a 50 to 55% intake margin. That's going to leave you with about a 40 to 45% gross profit margin. So straight away, your 50 becomes a 40. Okay, so what does that mean for your ratio, your framework? Well, let's think about what net profit you want to make. If you want to make a 20% net profit and you're starting with a 40 on the gross profit, what does that mean? 40 minus what equals 20? 40 minus 20 equals 20. So 40% gross profit margin means that you have to run your business on 20% OPEX in order to then achieve a 20% net profit. So that's all it means, is that you have to adjust those ratios accordingly. Now, by the way, running your business on 20% operating expenses is very hard. Has it been done? Yes, I've seen a business run on 6%, but that's a massive price-leading business. The reality is, particularly for you smaller businesses out there, is that you're probably going to want to spend about 20% on marketing, on advertising. Here we are talking about the need for you to run your whole business on 20%. So you've got to ask yourself, how likely is that? It's more likely that you'll be struggling to get to 30% operating expenses. So let's think about that. I'm starting with a 40% gross profit margin. I think that I can hit Paul's 30% that he's talking about in 50-30-20. I think that I can run the business on 30% OPEX. So 40 minus 30 equals 10. Your ratio might be 40-30-10. And then you have to ask yourselves, is 10% net profit enough for what I'm doing? At scale, 10% is great. You might be making $20 million, $30 million a year, and you're very happy with that 10%, which is pocketing you $3 million a year. But as a small side hustle starting out, 10% net profit of very small sales is likely to feel a little bit unfulfilling. So there are pros and cons to that multi-brand retailer approach. One of the pros is that you're selling hopefully reputable brands and you might get a quick uptake. The cons is the margin is so low. So you, in this side hustle with a gross profit margin that's low, you have to achieve scale very, very quickly, or the risk is that the profit will be so small that you'll lose interest. So again, the point I'm making here is that 50-30-20, I want you to think of that as a concept. And if you need to adjust those ratios, no problem. You've got to remember that your gross profit, your 50, minus your OPEX, your 30, equals your net profit. So just to adjust accordingly. I have some clients who have an 80% intake margin and a 60% gross profit margin. 60-30-30 might be your rule there. 60% gross profit margin minus 30% operating expenses leaves you with 60 minus 30 equals 30% net profit. Or you might say, well, I'm a 60% gross profit margin business. I'm going to spend a little more on advertising because I've got a bit of wiggle room in that gross profit. I'm going to spend more on advertising to try and scale quickly. So you might say, I'm 60 gross profit. I'm 35 on operating expenses because I want to spend a bit more on marketing. And therefore I'm 60 minus 35 equals 25. I'm a 25 net profit business. 60, 35, 25 might be your ratios. So the point is, in this framework, is to adjust accordingly. There's no right or wrong. You just must know what the bottom line is. If you go in with low gross profit margins, you've got to be understanding of that bottom line. Okay, so that's the concept that I'm trying to give you. By the way, 50-30-20 is what you should be achieving if you're starting your own product as a minimum. I want the brands that I work with to be achieving a minimum 20%. Some of my clients doing 35% net profit. So I really want you to think about that. Go away and look at your business and how it sits in that 50-30-20 framework. Another question that I often get is from alcohol brands, furniture brands, low margin industries. And they'll say those margins aren't possible in my industry. And I just refer back to the previous point I made. Sure, I know that. I've worked in those industries before. The point again is that you just need to adjust your ratios. That's the point. So if you're in furniture, your margins are probably closer to 40%. Again, you drop back, you change those ratios accordingly. You adjust your operating expenses to reach your desired bottom line. That's all you need to do. So it's not to say that every brand out there can get a 70% margin on their products. I know that's not possible. The point again is about adjusting your ratios. A lot of people also will say to me, oh, but at scale, I can have a poor margin at scale. I'm not making money now, but one day I'll be making money. Really, scale doesn't fix bad margins. If you've got a 40% gross profit margin and you're running your business on, 38% OPEX, so you're making a 2% profit, if your revenue grows and grows and grows quickly, your gross profit margin won't improve because those are variable costs. Sure, you might get some discounts with your suppliers, but the cost of sales are variable. They're freight. Freight increases as your revenue increases. So the idea that your gross profit margin improves with scale is really not true. Yes, your net profit margin, no, not necessarily. Your net profit margin can improve a little bit with scale because your rent might stay the same while your OPEX grows or your headcount. But in my experience, growing companies also grow their expenses quite quickly. So the reality is that if you're spending 38% running your business on a 40% gross profit margin, that 2% is likely to be there for some time. Yes, the 2% represents a bigger number as you scale. But the point I'm making here is that businesses that kind of can be a little bit deluded into thinking that scale will fix poor margins. In my experience, it doesn't. So I think just be really careful with those margins and always try and fight for that high margin from the start. It makes e-commerce a hell of a lot easier. Okay, so let's say that you've looked at your business and my 50-30-20 framework and you see that, yep, I've got the gross profit ticked off, I'm at 50, but I'm at 45 on my OPEX, and therefore my net profit is super low at 5%. By the way, that's really, really common. What do I do? Well, the first thing you do is you've made the right step by actually looking at it, by scrutinizing it. The way my brain works is in ratios. So just about every brand that I work with, I would know how much they spend on freight, wages, rent. I'm all in about ratios and frameworks. And so the next step you need to do, and we dive into this in one of the other podcasts, but the next step you actually need to do is say, well, where can I trim the fat? Where can I get the 30? Where can I get down to 30? Now, the most common expenditure in your business on the operating expenses side is going to be advertising. And I'm going to hazard a guess and say that it's going to be social media advertising, paid socials. Now, you should be really looking to bring that down to sub 20% of your monthly sales. There's some businesses that can spend more, but it's unlikely that you're spending 25 to 30% of your monthly sales on paid socials and you're being ultra efficient. So what I'm saying is that's generally the first place to cut. There are some other benchmarks that you should think about. For instance, your rent should be 1 to 2% of sales, really no more than that. Your wages, your headcount, you want to try and get that to 10% or less. 11% is fine, 10, 11%. But again, if you're on sort of like 18, 19% on marketing and 18, 19% on wages, your marketing's probably okay at 18, 19%. At 18, 90% on wages, you're a little bit high there, so you need to bring that down. So essentially what you're doing, you should have a spreadsheet open, and as a percentage of revenue, you should be looking at all of these items and seeing how much you're spending. So if you're spending 40% of your monthly revenue on operating your business, and you're at 30% of that into ads, that's too much. That's where you need to chop that down to 20 over time, not straight away, over time, because it means you're being inefficient. Now, if you're at 18, 19% on marketing, but you're at 20% on wages, you don't need to be at 20% running an e-commerce business on wages typically. So you should be trying to, again, over time, bring that down to 15. The beauty of this is there's not too many areas we can attack. So you're going to be faced with some tough decisions. I want to bring my operating expenses closer to Paul's 30% rule. Reality is by far your biggest expenditure is going to be on wages and ads, advertising. You've got to attack those two line items. Yeah, you might find that you're at 2.5% on rent. Great, try and work on that, but that's small fry. So really, I want to hit this point home as well, that if you want to make big changes in your online business, you've got to make big changes in your online business. So there's no point saying I'm not profitable enough, I'm not building enough cash in my business, but you're spending 5% on rent, you're spending 20% on wages and 30% on ads. Well, you want to improve your cash, your cash flow, you want to improve your profitability, start chopping. And there's no secret to this. You have to start chopping. Get that axe out and start chopping. That's not going to fix itself. Now, a lot of businesses just neglect that and they think that it'll just work itself out. You're going to be caught in that cycle of chasing revenue. Let me tell you right now, it's easier to impact your profitability on the cost lines rather than revenue lines. The revenue lines we can influence. We can run sales and we can bring out great product. We can influence, but we can't control sales. How often are we disappointed in our sales numbers when we set a high sales number and we don't hit it? What can you control? What you're spending. So you should always be attacking your profitability first from the costs, because you're in control of those costs. You've incurred those costs. So that's what you need to take control of first. Influence sales, take control of costs. The thing that I also want to remind people of is that we don't just want to be great brands, we want to be great businesses. You've chosen e-commerce as a career. Treat it like a business. So that doesn't mean if we're selling women's fashion, we're not just in fashion, we're in business. We're in the e-commerce business. If we're selling beauty products, we're not just in beauty, we're in e-commerce, we're in business. As a business person, how can you take on the world, the business world, without business fundamentals behind you? So getting to know your numbers is absolutely crucial, a crucial part of being a business person. It's not just about selling great dresses or great lipsticks or great computer equipment. No, you've got to be great at your numbers. So we really want to be known as great business people, great businesses, not just great brands. And that starts with knowing your numbers, getting in control of your numbers. And it's just not good enough to say that I'm not strong at numbers. You've got to get strong at numbers. How much time have you actually spent studying your numbers to say that you're not good at it? So if you want to be great at business and build this empire, you have to be great at business, not just great at design or great at fashion or great at beauty. You need to build up your business acumen. It is simply impossible for me to believe that you will go on to build this empire if you don't know your gross profit margin, you don't know your operating expenses, you don't know your cost of goods sold. You need to know those numbers. And that's what I'm really big on is not just, Facebook ads and so on. That's maybe 1% of an e-commerce business. How many of the 1%ers do you actually nail? It's not a bad idea to get in and get in under the hood of your business and scrutinize it. And when you get control of those numbers, it's amazing what you can do with your business. Control is an incredible thing. You can make smart, insightful decisions, what to invest in, where to spend, how much money I have, how much to pay myself. So it's really important that that all of us focus on being great businesses, not just great brands. Discipline is a massive part of any business, particularly e-commerce, and it's why I've created these frameworks. If you can stay within these frameworks with absolute discipline, I've seen time and time again businesses turn around massive improvements. There's one brand that I work with who has achieved a $700,000 a month improvement to their net profit every single month. Why? By scrutinizing their business, by reducing the operating expenses, of course, releasing great product each month as well, but just with absolute discipline. Running a good business requires incredible discipline. Discipline in the numbers, discipline in the structure, discipline in the KPIs. If you can get in there and be really disciplined with how much you're spending on everything, where you're investing your money, how you're doing your budget, introducing these disciplines to your business, you can make a lot of money really, really quickly. But it's important to have discipline in your arsenal as part of an e-commerce business operator, because I simply see way too many great creative businesses fall by the wayside because they don't have the discipline required to run great businesses. So that's it for today, the 50-30-20 rule. Follow me on socials at Paul Waddy E-commerce if you want to learn more. As always, drop me some questions. Hope you enjoyed this edition of The Side Hustle. I'll see you at the next one.